Welcome to Not My Generation, the political podcast that looks at governmental issues and events through a generational lens. I am Professor James Davenport. This is my colleague, Dr. Emily Stacey. And today we're going to be talking about racial justice, economic justice perhaps, and violence and protest in the United States, stemming from this time stemming from the death of one George Floyd, killed by a police officer. And I want to start off with one of my favorite quotes from Poet Laureate Maya Angelou, who said that justice and fair play and equality are like the air. We either all have them or we all don't. Amen. But there's no in between. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. The idea that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. Yep. And I want to start with that kind of frame of reference. I visited with, earlier in this week, Trey Savage, the editor-in-chief of nondoc.com. Trey was at the protests here in Oklahoma City over the weekend and had some insights from people he interviewed and had conversations with there. And so we're going to lead off with that conversation with Trace and then come back and offer our thoughts on all of this as well. So here's that conversation.
So I was at the Saturday rally at 23rd and Classen in Northwest Oklahoma City, and then I was also at Sunday's gathering on the east side of Oklahoma City, and walked. Didn't go to the state capitol and didn't end up going downtown for that. But we reported a bunch of things, and people can find that on nondoc.com. Overall, I would say, the weekend was obviously stressful. I think, well, at least for me and people in my profession, because on the one hand, our job is to be, observers of what happens and not try to make big judgments in the moment or even after the fact. So I'm a little limited in kind of what I feel, comfortable chatting about, but I will say overall it was the certainly Saturday at the 23rd and Classen area was one of the probably tensest moments I've covered. There were some clashes very early Saturday with police. I witnessed the second one personally and got video of that. It kind of found myself between the police and sort of the line of protesters who were upset that a guy had been arrested. And his name was Aaron Snyder. And I'm still trying to kind of figure out, exactly what happened with his situation. I've been in contact with his family and waiting for police reports from the city and stuff like that. But I would just say that it was, a pretty intense moment. And I feel like I probably I didn't, get a lot of sleep this weekend. And it was just, not only the weight of what has transpired in this country for years with police shootings, but also just the added element of this where, property is being vandalized. Mm-hmm. And there was, really a risk of bodily harm, both from, tear gas and rubber bullets and things deployed by police, but also, from the risk of being and demonstrating in the middle of a road. Right. There were a couple moments when I looked out in the middle of that street and there were a bunch of children in the middle of that street.
Now, there have been some comments made or accusations that there were elements that had inserted themselves into these protests that had purposes other than simply demonstrating regarding the George Floyd incident or the broader issue of police brutality, these types of things. Is that any kind of sense that you got? Because it was Saturday night that we saw more of this kind of clash between police and some elements that were there in the protest. Did you get the sense that there were the larger body was there to protest regarding police brutality, George Floyd, but there were some, maybe the more violent elements that were there for some other reason.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely most people who were there were there to be a part of a demonstration to push for change. Now, to what people view as the way to do that differs, even
Sure.
within all over the country. My understanding from what I can read and talk to people is that there are, differences of opinion within the Black Lives Matter movement,
Sure.
right? And there was, some people referred to Saturday's event as more of an organic kind of event. I felt like there was a heavy blue collar presence, if that kind of makes sense.
Sure.
But maybe that was a reflection of some of the folks who weren't present, which were some of the leaders of Oklahoma City's African American community who have been working on racial justice issues, especially with the police department, to my knowledge, for the last 5 years, or in many cases with some of the folks of the NAACP and some of the church leaders, for decades, right? So some of the folks that I knew I would see on Sunday for the Sunday Black Lives Matter OKC event, they just weren't at the event Saturday, and I felt like and so there's positives and negatives that come with anything, right? I mean,
Sure.
On the one hand, I think the crowd Saturday, especially after some of the initial, maybe leaders, the people who ran out in the street first and were sort of, stopping cars first and shutting things down first, they got arrested.
Mm-hmm.
So probably, in their absence, there was maybe a dearth of leadership on the ground. I interviewed a woman, Ms. Meekins, who had sort of helped, gather people by Facebook and things of that nature. And she was kind of on the side of the road, and I quoted her I said, I'm, worried about these cars because people were getting mad and zooming around, and there were a bunch of children in the road. And I said, I'm getting a little worried about that. And she said, yeah, I'm getting a little worried too. So, but she didn't, have any authority to do anything by that point. I mean, it was sort of, it was its own living, breathing crowd by that point. And on the one hand, I think that was organic, and it brought a lot of people maybe out, and it was a interesting spectacle in and of itself. But I think it also, really raised the stakes and allowed for what you said, which was that maybe people who had their own agendas or slightly different agendas, it gave them plenty of anonymity to pursue actions that maybe the majority of the crowd didn't agree with, or certainly didn't condone, and may not have had any idea that was going to happen. Right. I think there's a lot of anger right now in the country, and in many ways, some of that's understandable. I mean, a lot of it's understandable, obviously, but I think a lot of people were there because they were individually, frustrated, whether they were frustrated by seeing that what appears to be a terrible murder of George Floyd. Like that's the journalist in me saying, well, it's not a murder yet until, the jury convicts him.
Sure. Right.
But you get my point. I think obviously that was a big driver. Obviously, we've been having this conversation for a few years, and on the one hand, it seems like we keep having to have it, which covers up, maybe some of the positives that we've seen over the last few years, which would be the notion that, there is no question about whether these cops are going to be prosecuted.
Right.
It was done pretty quickly. The officer who, had his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck was fired, the next day.
Right.
And charges were filed against him. A charge was filed against him before the next week was over. So, that was not the case with Michael Brown. That was not the case with, I believe, Eric Garner. That was not the case with a lot of these other, situations. Terrence Crutcher Tulsa, that took longer. It was, and of course there was no conviction, in that case. So, I think on the one hand, there's evidence that some of the discussion of the last, 5 years or so has borne some positives in terms of, there were police officers all over the country who were saying that this was wrong. Right. Now maybe that's because this is one of the most egregious deaths we've ever seen caught directly on camera. It wasn't shaky. It wasn't blurry. It just was what it was. Right. So maybe that's why it was easier for people. But on the other hand, I think that there is progress being made in the public consciousness of this issue. Right. Right. The generation of students who are in your class are, maybe a little farther along in their thinking on these issues than students in your class would have been a decade ago. Right. And so that's good. On the other hand, it's not enough because, deaths keep happening.
Speaking of affecting change and having something positive come out of all of this, what has been your impression of the way political leadership has handled this situation just here in Oklahoma? We know, President Trump had his statement, going to call out the military if people don't get, but when you look at Oklahoma City and then Oklahoma as a state, what's your takeaway as far as, do you think the leadership is listening? Do you think they're like, yes, okay, we need to do something to address this issue? Or do you think they're just hoping this all dies down pretty quickly and we get back to dealing with COVID-19?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't say. I think I noticed a lot of political leaders being fairly silent about the demonstrations themselves. Mm-hmm. And
I don't think there were many of them out there, right?
Correct. Certainly not on Saturday. There was really nobody there Saturday from a political standpoint. Joshua Harris Till, president of the Young Democrats of America, was there. But from an elected leader's position, from the police chief to Councilwoman Hammond showed up a couple hours later downtown and did an interview. And then of course Sunday, Councilwoman Nice, Senator Young, a lot of folks were involved in that rally. But I can't, I don't know whether I would say they should have been more vocal ahead of time, or whether, I like to say, when in doubt, say nothing, right?
Sure.
And, I can't necessarily blame someone for saying, I don't know what's about to happen. I don't know what's going on. And I'm not going to, come out and make a big statement until I get some time. I think that Mayor Holt did that and waited until Saturday night till things got a little bit more precarious. And then he kind of got on TV and said some things, but but at the same time, I don't know whether, hey, hearing there's going to be a rally, if people show up and have some conversations ahead of time, maybe it keeps it from getting violent and out of hand. I don't really know. I mean, I was hesitant to come chat about this stuff because, there's a lot of unknowns, and sure. It's, I see it from a lot of different angles. And I guess that's my job.
Well, Trey Savage from nondoc.com, you guys have done great work, not just on covering this, but on keeping people informed of what's going on in our state and in the metro area. Thank you for spending a few minutes visiting with us about what you observed, who you talked to, those kinds of things. And hopefully this will, at the end of the day, lead to some positive change, not just in our community or our state, but nationally as well.
Thanks again to Trace for sharing his insights. Very interesting to hear from someone who was directly on the ground involved, right? And someone who can share what they saw firsthand and the people that they talked with.
I do want to give a shout out, not just to Trace, but there are some amazing Oklahoma independent journalists like Ben Felder, for example, who, like you said, were on the ground doing the Lord's work really during these protests. It is very difficult to know when there's going to be any sort of disorder breaking out, et cetera. And so those journalists on the ground are really, really in some dangerous situations sometimes. So thank you all for what you do.
Exactly. And while I didn't see this necessarily happen in Oklahoma, we do have reports of journalists being attacked, both by protesters and by police, right?
Yeah.
And so it is a precarious time. These are precarious events to be trying to cover, and for the most part, they're doing the best that they can.
Absolutely.
So you're absolutely right. We need to thank them for being willing to put themselves in that kind of position.
Yeah.
All right. So let's start with just kind of a recount of what kind of has prompted this current wave of protest, of discussion, of concern that has happened, which is the death of George Floyd. And do you want to kind of explain what happened here? We have video of this, so this is not something that we're just kind of hearing third hand. You can see directly what happened, but let's talk about the circumstances that prompted this spark.
Sure. So we're discussing the Minneapolis Police Department, obviously in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and they are a police department that has certainly been on the radar of the United States Justice Department, and certainly members of Black Lives Matter for the last at least few years. Some very high-profile killings have been at the hands of Minneapolis police officers, including Philando Castillo and most recently George Floyd. So in the most recent scenario, Mr. Floyd was at a kind of a convenience store type of location. Apparently a clerk in that store believed that he used a counterfeit 20 and called the police on Mr. Floyd, who came very quickly to apprehend him. There were 4 officers who came onto the scene, one of whom, Derek Chauvin, Derek Chauvin, is the officer who was charged first with third-degree murder. Actually, manslaughter, I believe, third-degree manslaughter in the beginning, for kneeling on Mr. Floyd's neck, the back of his neck, while he was very much detained on the ground, already in cuffs. So this officer was putting his weight on his neck for the better part of 9 minutes, and after a certain point, it has been reported that Mr. Floyd lost consciousness, and Officer Chauvin continued to kneel on Mr. Floyd's neck long after he had succumbed to his situation. So at this point, you have a 17-year-old girl who has been standing and witnessing this entire situation play out, and she is actually the one that the world can thank for having the video footage of George Floyd's death. Of course, these are not videos that we consume lightly, and certainly not for entertainment purposes, but for accountability and transparency purposes in our government, as your law enforcement is an extension of your government, an extension of you and I as within the civil society. Without forgetting, we pay taxes, we pay their salaries, right? So that's kind of the long and short of the situation with George Floyd. And so obviously, since Mr. Floyd's death and the video going viral, you have seen an outpouring of protests throughout the United States, including here in your own state, which is notoriously not quite a protest state, if you will.
Well, and so this sparks, and the reason this kind of strikes at this is it is a very visual, a very real-time almost scenario where you're seeing this event unfold. And for many, this is just the latest in a series of these kinds of events where particularly black men are being abused by police officers in some form or fashion. And so This is what you see emerging, and why you see groups like Black Lives Matter emerge, is that they're trying to point out that there is this disparity in how law enforcement interacts with especially black men versus other racial groups, and especially whites, but others as well. And that this disparity in treatment is causing real harm to their communities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would that be fair to
Yeah,
say?
absolutely. I do want to add a little asterisk here. Professor Davenport has mentioned the injustices affecting predominantly black men, and that is absolutely true statistically. But one high-profile case that has happened more recently is the case of Brianna Taylor, in which police officers, I believe this was in Louisville, mistakenly went into her residence at night. They were on a, they thought her house was a drug house that they were trafficking drugs out of. They mistook the address, went in. They did not have to announce who they were. It's a state where they do not have to announce themselves as police officers. Her boyfriend was in bed. This was, again, late at night. They were both in bed, and the boyfriend believed that they were being broken into, right? That the apartment was getting broken into, and so the boyfriend drew a gun on police who had not identified himself or themselves, and the police shot 8 rounds into Brianna Taylor, and she died on the scene in her apartment. A complete case of mistaken identity, mistaken house, and that young woman was an EMT working, day and night during the COVID crisis. And so, that's just one other high-profile case right now that has been impacting, the female community as well.
Exactly.
And let's not forget Sandra Bland's name as well.
And so the question becomes, what is leading to this disparity that we see in law enforcement? And we don't just see it in how police officers interact with these communities. We see it in sentencing differences, whether or not an individual will get a longer sentence or even be sentenced to prison for a particular crime versus being allowed just on parole or whatnot, or these types of things. And so we have a tremendous amount of social science data that point to these differences in outcomes all along the way.
Absolutely.
Interacting with what we refer to commonly as the justice system, right? If you include police officers, district attorneys, all the way through, and you have communities who feel as though they have been inappropriately targeted, if you will, for enforcement of certain laws. And so I want to step back for a second, and I think I'm gonna pull out some Max Weber on some folks, social scientist in the early 1900s, who stated, he defined government or the state as that entity which has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within a society. And I think we should never forget that at the end of the day, government is about violence in the sense that if we pass a law and we intend people to obey it, we're going to exert violence upon them to make them obey, right? And so that should always make us question, I think, what kind of laws are we really willing to enforce with violence, knowing that violence could lead to a person's death, right? And let's talk about some of these deaths. As you mentioned earlier, Dr. Stacey, George Floyd was killed over a possible fake $20 bill that it has not been demonstrated he knew necessarily was fake. I've not seen any reports that have said he knowingly was attempting to do this, right? Eric Garner in New York City, killed for selling fake cigarettes, or not fake cigarettes, but illegal cigarettes, right? Home rolled. Exactly, right? So the question becomes, are these the kind of things we're willing to see police officers kill people over? And if they're not, we need to be asking ourselves, what kind of laws are we writing, right? And this goes beyond just so-called criminal laws, where we're talking about drug laws or those kind. Even some of the laws that you would not necessarily associate with criminality are laws that get enforced and have terrible consequences for people. And I'm thinking of things like zoning laws that make it more difficult for builders to come in and build a quality, affordable housing in these communities, right? I'm thinking of occupational licensing laws that protect already well-established business owners and entrepreneurs from competition from people who want to enter that particular market, that particular entity. And so we protect them by making it hard to do certain types of jobs. One of the most egregious, in my opinion, are these laws about you have to have a license to braid hair in some states or some communities, right? Who are we protecting? I have never heard of anybody dying from having their hair braided. I haven't even heard anybody being seriously injured from having their hair braided. But I'm just
not
saying.
my expertise.
So we have these kinds of laws, and they have a huge impact on poorer communities, and these tend to be minority communities as well. And so we need to be thinking, how can we do this? If we are driving people from the legal work that is available into illegal work, and then we're saying, and now we are going to dramatically ramp up enforcement against illegal work, what do you expect is going to happen? Right? You're going to have conflict. You're going to have violence. And many of these communities absolutely feel as though the police in their communities today are not there to protect them, but they're there as an occupying force. They're there to prevent them from doing some suspected harm that they're just convinced that is going to happen. And so you have a larger police presence in those inner city communities than you do in the suburbs. And those in the suburbs who are more wealthy, who have better access to legal representation, can find ways of minimizing their impact with law enforcement that those in these poor communities simply do not have.
Yeah, and so we kind of were talking before we decided to hit the record button, and we were talking about the militarization of the police in the United States. Right now we have seen, obviously, President Trump call on the National Guard, number one in D.C., but you've also seen some governors in various states across the United States also call on the National Guard, including here in your own state, but also police departments, even in more rural areas, like Newcastle, Oklahoma, I believe, has an armored vehicle.
Right.
I'm not sure what's going on in Newcastle, Oklahoma, that is that lit. However, I do wonder about the militarization of the police. As a libertarian, what do you make of this?
This has been something that's been going on now for about 30 years, in which we have increasingly treated the military as some type of or the police as some type of quasi-military institution. And it ranges from recruiting former military individuals to serve in the police force, to armaments, whether it's firearms or vehicles or things like this. If you want to see the militarization of the police firsthand, attend any of these 4th of July parades that you'll see, and they will be proudly rolling out all of the equipment, and much of it purchased through Army surplus type of things. And we have to remember that law enforcement is not a military activity. Those are two distinctly different activities. And they have different mentalities, a different mentality from a soldier to a police officer. And we should not expect them, and we should not want our police officers having that mentality. And in many ways, we do not want them having that kind of equipment. But this is something that has, as I said, has been going on for at least about 30 years now. As we have ramped up things like the drug war and prosecuting that more and going in and trying to eradicate that. This is another case where prohibition tends to cause more harm than good. And to prosecute that, the law enforcement agencies have demanded more equipment, higher caliber equipment, more force, if you will, in order to carry out those laws that have been passed. And so, yes, it's just another extension of this issue of the use of force. We have decided we don't want this stuff happening, and we are going to give our law enforcement officers heavy equipment.
And that should be concerning to all.
It should be concerning to all of us, right? Because it's not, as the quote from Maya Angelou at the beginning, I said, if you are creating a situation for any one group, you're creating a situation that can lead to other groups as well. And so we have to understand that this is going on, and this is a part of the problem. And in our conversation before we started recording, one of the things that struck me was there are so many aspects to this, and it can be overwhelming at times, right?
Absolutely.
And when you get overwhelmed with all of this information, for some people, the way you deal with that is you just ignore it, or you just try to tune it out, right? But we should not be tuning out these voices crying out for real justice, right? For real equality under the law. And we should be asking ourselves, have we constructed a scenario, a system, if you will, that places a group of our citizens, our fellow citizens, at odds with the rest of us because of the way we enforce these laws and the types of laws that we are creating.
Yeah, I saw a tweet that perfectly encapsulates everything you just said. Racial justice should not be controversial. This should not be something that we are fighting in the streets over. This should be something that we want for our society.
Right, exactly.
Absolutely.
And it's hard because when you talk about race in America, there are a segment of people who don't experience the kind of things that are going on.
Yeah.
And so when they don't experience it, it's hard for them to internalize that or to perceive it as someone else's reality.
Right.
And so the first thing is to deny it. Another group of people who may not deny it, but who may sit there and look at it and say, well, that's not something that happens as widespread, right? It's not something that affects everybody. There's just a small problem.
Right.
But remember, when you're in a country of 350 million people, a small problem of, say, 5%, and you're talking quite a few people, right? Millions of people at this point that are being impacted by this. And so we shouldn't discount that when we know that we have this kind of problem. You also have people that have a hard time distinguishing when you talk about a system that has negative consequences on a group of people. In this case, we're talking about a group of people because of their race.
Right.
A lot of people, when you start talking about that, immediately begin to think what you're saying is they are, as individuals, racist. And you, listen, if we want to have a talk about racism in general, I think we have plenty of evidence they're still racist in the United States. But you can have a majority of people who are not racist as individuals having constructed a system that has a dramatically disparate impact on a particular racial group, whether that was intended or not. I would argue in some cases it was intended, and in other cases it was not intended. But let's leave out intention for a second and just say, you can create something that has a negative impact on people without knowing it. Right. When you're presented or confronted with that evidence, it's kind of incumbent on you to try to do something to correct that problem. Right?
Yes.
And I think that's where we're at today, is that there are some people who want to deny that such a system exists. There are some people who may recognize it exists but don't feel like there can be anything done. You have other people who are on the other extreme who have been living under this type of scenario for quite some time, who are immensely frustrated that they can't get the majority to see their plight. And so you have all of this kind of bubbling up. You throw on top of that the COVID-19 situation and lockdowns and people losing their jobs and financial insecurity already present, and you have the perfect powder keg for something like this really exploding. And I think for those of us who have not personally suffered the type of things that we're talking about, we need to be able to take a step back and look and say, what is the complaint? What is the concern that's being expressed here? And can we readily identify it? And can we take action to prevent it? And who should that action be incumbent upon? A lot of times, we turn and say the government should do something when really individuals should be doing something. And listen, self-government, we like to talk about, I love talking about self-government, but self-government is messy. It is complicated. It is not easy to do. Self-government, in my opinion, would say when you see a police officer with their knee on a man's neck who's already subdued and he's holding him there for 9 minutes and the man can't even struggle to get up, you as a citizen confronting that officer and saying, it's time to change your tactics. It's time to change your behavior. That's self-government, not sitting there and wondering why the 3 or 4 other officers aren't doing anything about it, right? Self-government is about citizens taking ownership of what's happening, not relying on others under the color of government to do it for us. And I'll be quite frank, I think until you see that kind of self-government, we're going to continue to see these kinds of episodes, right? And this is not to justify, by the way, this is not to justify violence on the other side, right? This is not to say that breaking and looting and beating up people with whom you disagree with out of your own frustration is appropriate.
Right.
Don't want to go there. But it's to say that if we have people that have been so motivated and to take those kind of actions, maybe we need to step back and ask ourselves what's going on to prompt them to such anger, to such frustration.
Yeah. I mean, so I want to open, obviously, this can of worms with you because I know that you were misrepresented in I guess we can call it a blog, maybe?
I guess, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure what to call it. Anyway, Professor Davenport was misrepresented in a blog earlier this week, kind of equating the looters and the rioters with the 4th of July and with patriotism. And the point that you were trying to make is one that people who study social movements, revolutions, such as myself, my entire dissertation, for example, but a lot of other academics that I follow online have been making this point for a couple of weeks now. You can't, unfortunately, make an omelet without breaking some eggs, right? Revolutions, right? Systemic change, codification, legislation of actual change doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it typically doesn't happen without there being some sort of economic destruction, and that's where Professor Davenport was really kind of pointing to, equating the Boston Tea Party, right? Your whole country began through a revolutionary spirit of economic destruction. The colonists were doing things that were detrimental to themselves by dumping those thousands of pounds of tea into the harbor, but they were doing so at that point because there was nothing else to lose. They were ready for independence, and the French Revolution. I mean, I can go through history and name various revolutions that occur, and again, we're not certainly condoning violence or looting or rioting whatsoever. What I am saying is that it is absolutely commonplace in revolutions where you get systemic political, social change for there to be some sort of rocks thrown, if you will, proverbially, at the regime, and it's going to have to hit their pocketbooks, typically, for them to listen to you.
Well, and listen, our own country has a long history of both violent and nonviolent protest.
Yes.
And both types have been successful and unsuccessful, depending on the nature of the outcome of what was going on. And at the end of the day, when we talk about this, we're not talking about, I think, the French Revolution here. We're talking about very specific policies that have been enacted over time that it would not be that difficult to draw back
at all.
That it would not be that difficult to come back and say, you know what, these may have seemed right at the time, but they haven't panned out the way we thought. Maybe we should undo them. Maybe we have caused a group of people dramatic harm by this means, and it's time to readdress that, right? That's not revolutionary. That's basic, being an adult, right? I thought this was the right thing to do. I tried it. It didn't work out. I need to change course, right? And we're just talking about that in a collective nature, right? The drug war, we may have been afraid at one time, but and we should have learned our lesson with perhaps the alcohol prohibition in the early 1900s. But now we should have plenty of evidence to say this isn't working, and we're creating a criminal class that we don't need to be creating. Right? Maybe these laws designed, in some cases, look. The fact is, modern advocates of high minimum wages don't understand that the minimum wage itself had some very racist origins in it itself, right? You had, in this case, early on in the 1930s, you had African Americans trying to escape Jim Crow in the South, going to the north looking for occupations, and you had northern whites and their representatives in Congress upset that they were willing to do the same work as those whites for less.
Right.
So what is the result? We say, let's pass a minimum wage. What does that do? Well, it prices those poor African Americans out of the labor market.
Right.
And that's, again, when you take people out of the legal way of earning a living, when you take people's ability to financially care for themselves out from under them, and you push them into a situation where their only option is to engage in what we've declared to be illegal behavior, and then you say, and now we're going to heavily prosecute that illegal behavior, you're setting yourself up, your society up for massive conflict. And I think in many cases, that's exactly what we've done.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, you're seeing kind of the trickle down from 1990s, early 2000s criminal justice reform or criminal policies.
It's going to be tough on crime. Right?
Yes, exactly. During the Clinton era as well. I want to go back just really briefly because I did mention rioters, looters, quote unquote, et cetera. The destruction being linked to these protests nationwide. It's been interesting, right? Because, of course, you have the administration, your Trump administration, who have been linking this destruction to Antifa, right? The kind of loose organization of not necessarily anti-government, but definitely anti-fascist organization whose members tend to be a little bit more militant than peaceful protesters typically are. They have been a favorite target of President Trump for a very long time for obvious reasons. But it was discovered by CBS and NBC News over the course of this week that Antifa accounts on Twitter have actually been linked to white nationalist group Identity Europa. And so we have, the administration, including Attorney General Barr, just yesterday kind of bemoaning Antifa. And of course, again, rightfully so. Their tactics are definitely out of the norm of peaceful protest. However, kind of invoking their name and it leading to this revelation that it's actually not Antifa who are sowing this discontent and calling for violence online. It's actually this white nationalist group.
Well, and I think that's, that's something that a caution that I would say is that a lot of people now have pivoted from the outrage of the death of George Floyd and all that represents that we've been discussing here, and they pivoted to being outraged about the looting and such like that.
Yes.
Don't let what is legitimately something that should not be happening, the looting, the harm, the violence, distract you from what is certainly, I believe, the greater harm here, which is what we've done to certain segments of our communities, right? Don't let that, and the fact is, I think all protests, and this is just one of the most recent, have elements or have people who want to insert themselves into the protest who have motives beyond what the majority of those who are protesting have, right?
Well, and the kid who defaced the state capitol over the weekend had nothing to do with the rally and really just wanted to come vandalize something.
Right, and what did you see there? You saw protesters taking action to remedy that, right? To clean that up. And so I think we have to remember the vast majority of these folks are there to call attention to a problem that they believe is a reality in their communities, and they want the rest of us to understand it and to help take action to solve it. And they're not there to cause destruction and to cause harm. And so we shouldn't be distracted by those who are. That doesn't, again, that's not justifying anything, and that's not saying that it's not a big deal. That is harm. But it's to say there's a larger harm that has been building over time. That if we address that, this other harm diminishes tremendously, right? There's less aggravation, there's less frustration, there's less of a bullying point to come over.
And there's something to be said about these protests, and again, not condoning the violence, etc. But yesterday we did see Attorney General Keith Ellison up the charges on Officer Chauvin, right?
That's correct.
Now up to second degree, and he charged the other 3 officers involved with George Floyd's death. So, we talk about protests not really getting us anywhere, unfortunately, too often, but definitely the people out in the streets, and it being so ubiquitous, it being nationwide, it being so loud, it being in social media, it being on everybody's radar. Instead of breaking news COVID-19, it's been breaking news protests on the streets for the last 9 days. You know, that's a short amount of time for change to happen, and really for those protests to have achieved at least one of their short-term goals. I won't get all academic on you, but social movements, political movements need to have goals, you know, achievable goals, and this was certainly the charging of these officers was an important one.
Well, and listen, we've went longer than we normally do today, but this is something that is relevant, is present, and we felt important to address. If you're sitting there and you're asking, well, what can I do? What as a citizen can I do? I think the first thing to do is to say, have I engaged with people who are different with me? Have I engaged with people? Have I listened to people who have different experiences than I do? And have I discovered that maybe the experiences that I have had are not the same as theirs? And then ask the question, are there things that we have done societally, through the government, that have caused some of these situations to occur? And can I, as a citizen, advocate on behalf of my fellow citizens whose voices may not be as loud as mine, right? Again, when you are in the majority, you have a much louder voice than those who are not. And so that's action that you can take. Simply being kinder and practicing self-government. When you see somebody treating someone inappropriately, whether we're talking about a law enforcement officer or just another citizen, someone at the store, standing up for that person who's being treated inappropriately, and using your power, right, as a citizen, using your power as someone who can do that, and saying, listen, we have to behave better, we have to act better. I think those are simple things that we can do that will help alleviate much of this problem as we look to solve through government institutions and agencies and such, some of these larger societal issues.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think being an ally is a major, major step to remedying this situation through the civil society. It's going to take much more than just the government passing some laws for discrimination and racism and inequality in our society to go away. It's going to take you and I. It's going to take that personal responsibility, that self-governance, and it's going to take us being empathetic and being allies to one another to really accomplish that. And I really must say, and he doesn't know I'm going to say this, but it's a joy to have such a wonderful ally in Professor Davenport, to have him as a colleague to bring up these topics. He suggested this topic for this week's podcast. So to have someone like him on faculty in the news media out there writing his dissertation, to know that there are folks out there who are wonderful allies to the minority community, whether it's African American or otherwise, you know, there are good people out there. So make sure that you appreciate all people.
Well, and you know, I think your generation and the younger generation coming up are much more comfortable with this than even mine or some others. And I think that's one of the positives about the younger generation. They are more diverse. They're more comfortable with diversity.
Sesame Street kids.
And they're more comfortable having these kind of conversations. And I would say the older age groups are. And so that's certainly one difference between the generations that we see. And I think them helping the rest of us identify these problems. And listen, youth comes with a lot of inexperience, a lack of knowledge in some areas, but we shouldn't discount what they do come with, right? And so when they identify problems, we should be able to take our experiences and our knowledge and say, okay, how do we fix these problems? And not be resentful that they brought the problem to us, right? Well, thank you for joining us for this extended edition of Not My Generation. We hope you've enjoyed it. We hope it's been valuable to you. We'd love to hear back from you. You can always email us at
notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu.
Awesome, and we look forward to visiting with you again next week.